Montana Territory. July 1883, dust rose behind the wagon wheels like smoke from a dying fire, and Willa Jameson did not look back. She sat stiff-spined on the worn bench seat, her hands blistered from holding the reins too long, her heart even rawer. The sun had started its slow fall behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, but she had not stopped driving since dawn. Two children sat beside her, quiet in the way children got when they had seen too much. Bonnie, only 6, clutched her rag doll like it was the last real thing left in the world. Benjamin, a year older, stared straight ahead with eyes too old for his face. They had been left behind in a sod house outside Helena. Her sister had taken sick after the last baby and never recovered. The man who had fathered them, Willa would not call him anything more, had vanished before the boy could walk. Willa had arrived too late to save her sister, but not too late for the children. Now they were hers. The wagon jerked over a rut, and Bonnie whimpered. "It is all right, sweetheart," Willa murmured, reaching to tuck the girl's hair behind her ear. "We are almost there." There was no real destination, only a sliver of land she had inherited from an uncle she barely remembered. It was 30 miles west of Bozeman, a stretch of pine-shadowed valley with a half-burned barn and a creek that ran dry every August. But it was quiet. It was hers. She could raise the children there and maybe start to breathe again. They reached the edge of the property by nightfall. The fence posts leaned like old men, and the gate hung off one hinge. She stepped down from the wagon, her legs shaky, and lifted Bonnie into her arms as Benjamin scrambled after her. The barn looked worse than she remembered. The roof sagged, and one side was scorched black. But the little cabin beyond was still standing. She walked up the path with Bonnie pressed close and Benjamin clutching her skirt. The door creaked open when she pushed. The place smelled of dust and cedar and disuse. But the hearth was intact and the floor was dry. That was enough. She set Bonnie down inside, turned to fetch the bags from the wagon and froze. A man stood in the yard. Tall, broad-shouldered and quiet as the dusk itself. His hat was pulled low over dark blonde hair and his shirt was dusted from the trail. He did not move, did not speak, just waited as if he had been expecting her. Willa reached slowly for the rifle in the wagon seat. "I do not want trouble," she said. "I reckon not," the man answered. His voice was low, steady. "Name's Kade Ashford. I live on the ridge past the creek." "You must be Willa." Her fingers tightened on the stock. "How do you know my name?" He nodded toward the land behind her. "My father used to ride fence with your uncle. When the letter came through the post office about the claim transfer, I figured you might show up." Was not sure when. She let go of the rifle. The children had come to the doorway behind her, watching. "I am not looking for help," she said. "Did not offer any," Kade said. "Just came to see if you made it." He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back into the night. 3 days passed before she saw him again. Willa spent them dragging fallen branches from the yard, patching the cabin roof with oilcloth, and hauling water from the creek with Benjamin trailing her like a little shadow. Bonnie stayed close to the hearth, helping fold blankets and sweep out corners with small, serious hands. On the 4th morning, there was a knock at the door. She opened it with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back, and there he was again. Kade. Holding a sack of flour and a small wrapped bundle. "Figured you might be short on supplies," he said. "I did not ask you for anything." "No," he agreed, "but the nearest store is 20 miles and your wagon axle is cracked." She blinked. "You looked at my wagon, fixed it too," he said, like it was nothing. "You will still need a new bolt come winter, but it will hold for now." He handed her the sack. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hands were calloused, warm. Bonnie peeked from behind her skirt. Kade crouched down and offered the bundle. Brought something for you too." She took it carefully. Inside was a wooden horse, carved smooth and painted with care. Her eyes lit up. "Thank you," she whispered. Kade looked back at Willa. "I will be around if you need anything." "I will not," she said, but when he left, her hands trembled as she closed the door. Summer deepened. Willa worked the land with a stubbornness that came from heartbreak and survival. She cleared brush, planted late beans behind the cabin, and set snares along the creek. Each evening, she collapsed onto the straw mattress with the children curled against her sides. Kade came by every few days, never uninvited, never staying long. Sometimes he left tools on the porch, sometimes a basket of eggs. He never asked for thanks. One afternoon, Benjamin got caught in a snare. Willa heard the scream and dropped her wash basin, running barefoot through the brush. She found him crying, his knee bleeding and his leg twisted. When she lifted him, he screamed again. "I need help," she told herself, and then louder to the trees. "Kade!" He came fast. She did not know how he heard her, but he did, boots thudding across the dry ground, eyes sharp with worry. He knelt beside her, checked the boy's leg with gentle fingers. "Not broken," he said, "but he will need to stay off it a while." He carried Benjamin back to the cabin in his arms. Willa followed, silent. That night, Kade stayed to help build a splint, boiled water, checked the boy's fever. When Benjamin finally slept, Kade stood to leave. Willa stopped him at the door. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Because you look like a woman who has been holding the world alone for too long." She looked away, throat tightening. "I do not know how to be anything else." "You do not have to be," he said. "Not with me." She cried that night, quiet tears, alone by the fire when the children slept and the wind outside whispered through the trees. She had not cried in years. Not when her sister died, not when she buried the last of the money under a rock near the creek. But now her chest ached with something she did not understand. Kade did not ask anything of her. He just showed up, day after day, with his steady hands and quiet strength. And Willa found herself leaning toward him like a plant toward the sun. She saw him with the children, how he taught Benjamin to whittle, how he helped Bonnie learn to skip stones. He never tried to take her place, but somehow he made space for her to breathe. And for the first time in her life, she did. She was still afraid. But every time he looked at her like she was worth the waiting, the walls she had built around her heart softened. And the way he touched her hand that night just once, just gently made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could learn to love again. By mid-August, the beans had taken to the soil better than Willa expected, curling their green fingers up the sticks Benjamin had set in the dirt. The heat had settled in thick, pressing sweat from her brow before noon most days. She rose early, worked until her arms ached, and tried not to think about the winter that would come too soon. There was no time to rest, but the rhythm of the work steadied her. Kade didn't speak much when he came by, which suited her. He brought her lengths of fencing wire once, and another time a hen that had stopped laying but still scratched for bugs and kept Bonnie amused for hours. He never offered advice unless she asked, and never stayed past sundown unless the children begged him to stay for supper. That evening, she found him mending the hinge on the cabin's back door without asking. "You could have waited for me to say something," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You didn't need to," he replied, not looking up. It was sagging. She leaned against the post, watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt as he drove the last nail in. "You always fix things that aren't yours," he straightened, hammer still in hand. "Not always. Just when they matter to me." Bonnie's laughter rang from the creek and Willa's gaze drifted that way. "You could stay for stew if you want." His reply was a simple nod. No hesitation, no questions. They ate on the porch. Benjamin talked about a bird's nest he'd found near the pines. Bonnie hummed while picking at her bread. Kade listened, quiet as ever, but his eyes were gentle when they landed on the children. When the bowl was empty and the dusk thickened, Willa walked him to the path. Neither reached for the other. They never did. But just as he turned, she said, "You always this patient, I can be." "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just keep letting me walk beside you." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The next morning she found a small stack of chopped firewood just outside the door. She didn't ask, and she didn't stop her smile either. Kade didn't come around for 5 days after that. Willa told herself she didn't mind. She had too much to tend. Benjamin's cough had come back with the dry wind, and one of the goats had gone lame. Still, at night when the porch creaked and it wasn't him, something in her chest tightened. On the 6th day, she saw him riding in from the ridge. He dismounted slow, led his horse by the reins. There was a stillness about him that hadn't been there before. She met him halfway across the yard. "Everything all right?" He nodded once. "Had to help with a calving, neighbor's mare. Took longer than it should have." She waited, sensing more beneath his words. He looked past her for a moment toward the cabin's roof. "You ever think about leaving?" "Leaving what?" "This place. The work, the weight of it." She crossed her arms, squinting into the sun. "I've had too many things taken to run from something that's mine." He met her eyes then, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before, something worn and vulnerable. "I wasn't talking about running." She didn't move. The wind stirred the hem of her skirt, but she stood rooted. "You asking me to follow you somewhere?" "No," he said. "I'm asking if there's room beside you, if you want that." She looked down at her hands, stained from the soil and calloused from the handle of a hoe. She thought about how long it had taken her to feel steady again. But when she looked up at him, she saw the quiet waiting in his stance, the kind of man who didn't need to be needed, only wanted to be chosen. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Me neither," he replied. "But I'd learn it with you." Willa felt something shift, then not a sudden breaking open, but a slow, sure unspooling of the knot in her chest. She stepped forward, not much, just enough that their shadows touched. "You could stay for supper again," she said. "If you're not too tired." "I'm never too tired for you," he said, plain and sure. She didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't pull away when he reached for hers. Inside, the stew simmered. Outside, the last light of day bathed the valley in gold. And for the first time in years, Willa didn't brace herself for what came next. She simply breathed. The first frost clung to the edges of the grass before the sun had cleared the ridge. Willa stood at the edge of the garden bed, her breath white in the air, a wool shawl drawn tight over her shoulders. The vines had gone brittle overnight. She bent to pull the last of the beans, her fingers stiff and slow. Kade's footsteps came over the hill, steady and unhurried like always. He carried a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. "Hard freeze came faster than I thought," she said without looking up. He set the sack down beside her. "Brought oats and some dried apples from Mrs. Talbot's place. She said if you bring her any seeds come spring, she'll trade again." Willa stood, brushing her hands against her skirt. "I'll have to find out what kind of seeds she needs." "She wants something hardy," he said. "Said the last batch she planted wouldn't take." Willa nodded once, her gaze on the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. "Bonnie's been asking about schooling. There's a teacher in Gallatin. Rides out every few weeks to check on the scattered places." He paused. "If you want, I can ask him to stop here." "I'd like that," she said, "but only if it don't put you out. I'd ride twice that if it meant she got to learn her letters." She looked at him then, eyes soft but unreadable. "You always do that, put other folks first." "Not always," he said. "Just when something feels worth the trouble." A jay cried from the trees, sharp against the quiet. Willa bent again, pulling the last of the beans free and tucking them into her apron. "Ben's been walking better. He's been asking to help with the woodpile." "He's got your spine," Kade said. "Doesn't like to be idle." "He's too young to carry that kind of weight," she said. Kade stepped closer, his voice low. "So are you." She didn't answer, not for a long stretch. When she did, her voice had dropped. "I don't know how to stop. If I put it down, even for a minute, I'm afraid I won't know how to pick it back up again." Kade didn't argue. He didn't touch her. He just stood near, letting her speak into the chill morning. "You ever think about what life was supposed to be?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "Before the war. Before my brother didn't come home. After that, I stopped asking what it was supposed to be and started trying to make it livable." She turned slowly toward him. "You never told me about him," he shrugged once. "There wasn't much to tell. He was loud where I was quiet. Always getting into something. He got himself shot outside Vicksburg and I got home just in time to bury him." "I'm sorry," she said. "So was I," he replied. "But it taught me something. That waiting to live don't keep death from coming. It just keeps you from having anything to hold when it does." Willa breathed in through her nose, slow. "You saying I've been waiting too long? I'm saying you deserve more than a life built on surviving." Her hands tightened around her apron. "And you'd be part of that. The living, if you'll have me." The wind moved through the dried brush, rustling the edges of the world. Willa didn't move, but her jaw slackened just slightly and the lines at the corners of her mouth softened. "You'd stay through a whole winter?" she asked. "I'd stay through as many as you let me." She looked down at the ground, then up again, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know how to start over." "You're not starting over," he said. "You're building forward." A crow flew overhead, its wings cutting a shadow across the frost. "I've been alone so long, I don't remember how not to be," she said. "Then let me remind you," he said. "Bit by bit, day by day." She looked at the cabin, at the faint sound of Bonnie's humming from inside, at the smoke rising soft and steady. Then she looked at him. "All right," she said. "But you'll have to be patient." He smiled, not wide but sure. "I've got time." And for the first time she let herself step toward him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Not a promise, just a beginning. But it was hers no longer taken, no longer borrowed, hers to give. He didn't try to hold her. He didn't need to. They stood like that until the sun rose over the ridge and melted the frost from the earth. The first snow came early, just a thin veil of white resting soft on the firs and rocks, but enough to remind Willa that the land didn't wait for anyone. She stood beside the woodpile, running a gloved hand over the chopped length stacked shoulder high, and counted what was left. It wouldn't last the winter, not without more. Kade's boots crunched behind her before she heard his voice. "I can bring down 2 more loads from the ridge tomorrow. There's a stand of dry pine near the western slope." Willa didn't turn. "I can cut it myself." "You could," he said, "but you'd be out there for hours, and the children need you here." She brushed snow from a split log. "I'm not used to someone thinking about what I need." "You'll have to get used to it," he said. She let out a slow breath and turned to face him. His coat was dusted with flakes, and his hair curled damp beneath his hat. He looked at her like the winter couldn't touch him. "You ever think about marrying?" she asked. His brow lifted, but he didn't take a step back. "Thought about it plenty. Never saw a reason to before you." Willa's fingers tightened around the edge of her glove. "I don't have anything to offer except a patch of land and 2 children who already call you their friend." "That's not nothing," he said. "That's a home." She studied his face lined from sun, not worry, and searched for doubt. Found none. "I never wore a ring," she said. "Never had a dress finer than the one I sewed to bury my sister." "I don't care about rings or dresses," he said. "I care about the way you walk through fire and come out steady." She looked down. the wind tugging at her braid. "You'd take a woman who's tired and not good at saying things plain. I'd take a woman who knows when to be quiet and when to stand her ground. I'd take you." They stood like that, snow brushing down soft between them until she finally met his eyes again. "I'd have you," she said. "If you want that name tied to mine." "I do," he said. Her lips parted, but no words came. She reached for his hand instead. He took it, warm and solid in hers, and that was answer enough. Inside, the children stirred Bonnie's voice clear and high as she hummed a tune Willa didn't recognize. Willa glanced toward the door. "We'll need to tell them," she said. "They already know," Kade said. "They've been waiting for you to catch up." She laughed, then not loud, but real, and leaned into him for just a moment, her forehead resting against his shoulder. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll take the wagon and cut that pine, together. I'll hitch the team at first light." He kissed her temple, gentle as the snowfall. Then he left her standing by the woodpile with the snow melting into her lashes and something warm blooming in her chest she thought she'd never feel again. Not hope. Not yet. But something stronger. Something steady. Something that looked a lot like peace. The wedding was quiet, as Willa had asked. Not for lack of care, but because the land had taught them both that love didn't need a crowd to be true. Reverend Collings rode in from Willow Creek, his coat patched at the elbow and his boots dusted from the trail. He stood beneath the cottonwoods that lined the back of the cabin, a small Bible in one hand and his hat tucked under his arm. Bonnie wore a crown of woven pine and dried lavender, her feet bare as she scattered wild rose petals from a tin pail. Benjamin stood beside Kade, taller now, his collar starched and his hands still. The boy's eyes didn't leave Willa once. She wore blue. A dress she'd stitched from cloth traded weeks earlier, with sleeves just long enough to cover the marks time had left. Her hair was plaited tight down her back, and the only ornament she wore was a single button from her sister's old shawl, pinned at her collar. As the vows were spoken, Kade kept his hand steady in hers, his voice low and even. When Willa spoke, her voice caught on the first word, but she didn't look away. Not once. When the Reverend said, "You may seal it," Kade touched her cheek first, then kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire. It was one of shelter, of choosing. Afterward, they ate cornbread and beans under the sky, and Mrs. Talbot, who had come with her eldest son and a sack of dried pears, played a tune on the fiddle that made Bonnie twirl until she fell in the grass. Benjamin leaned his head against Willa's arm once the sun dipped low, and she let it stay there. That night, after the children were asleep in their loft and the fire had burned to an orange hush, Willa and Kade sat together on the edge of the bed they had moved into the cabin's back room. "You sure?" he asked. Her fingers curled over his wrist, thumb resting against the scar he'd once told her came from a horse that wouldn't load after a storm. "I've never been more." He undid the buttons of her dress slowly, not like a man eager, but like one reverent. And she undressed him in turn, finding the stories in his skin the way he had once read the worry in hers. When they lay together, it was not hurried. It was two people learning how to be held. Winter came hard that year. The wind howled through the trees for days at a time, and the snow piled against the north wall high enough that Benjamin had to dig a tunnel to the barn door with a shovel made from scrap wood and iron. But the cabin held. Kade built a second chimney flue that kept the back room warm enough to sleep without coats. Willa taught Bonnie how to knit by firelight, her fingers guiding the girls until they moved smooth. Benjamin and Kade carved a toy wagon together, and when it was done, they painted it with leftover milk and soot until it gleamed pale gray. They passed the shortest nights reading aloud from the old book Kade had brought down from his father's place. Willa took turns voicing the chapters with him, her voice growing steadier with each page. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, she'd rest her head on Cade's shoulder, and he'd kiss her crown without a word. When the thaw came, it came sudden. Water rushed through the creek that had been dry since August, and the sound of it filled the valley like birdsong. Willa planted sweet peas along the cabin wall. Cade added a lean-to near the barn for the goat and her new kid. Bonnie ran barefoot, chasing butterflies with a ribbon tied to a stick. Benjamin spent whole afternoons digging a trench to guide runoff from the garden. One morning, Willa stood at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed, watching the sun rise. Cade came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You ever think it'd look like this?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I hoped." He kissed the skin just below her ear. "Seems to me we've got enough now." She leaned into him. "Not just enough. We've got good." In late summer, they built a second room onto the cabin, not out of necessity, but out of the quiet belief that life might keep growing. Willa painted the walls with a brush made from pine bristle and twine. Cade carved a cradle from the cottonwood that had shaded their vows. When the baby came the following spring, Willa labored through the night with Cade's hand in hers and Mrs. Talbot murmuring calm words from the foot of the bed. At dawn, a girl was born, red-faced and loud, her fingers curling around Willa's like ivy. They named her Fern. Bonnie took to her like a second mother, and Benjamin, now nearly as tall as Cade, carved her a rattle from aspen wood. Willa nursed her by the hearth, her eyes on the fire, her back warm against Cade's chest. He would press his lips to her temple, his hand resting over her belly, and whisper, "Thank you." Years passed as they do. The garden grew wider. The fence line held. The children grew into their own and stayed near. And each night, when the lamps were out and the wind moved soft against the glass, Willa would reach for the man beside her, and he would draw her close, and she would remember the woman she had been before she learned she could be loved like this. Not in spite of the weight she carried, but because of it, because he had seen it, and stayed. They never built more than they needed. They never wanted to. But when the sun rose over that valley, it rose on a life made whole. On a woman who had once come too late to save her sister, but just in time to save herself, and on a man who had never asked to be needed, only to be let in. Together they endured. They changed. They loved, and they were happy. Always.